Please join me in welcoming John Bolton.
Coming out in weather like this. We didn't have it quite as bad in Washington, so I was able to make it up here on the train. I hope you'll take care of me tomorrow morning and allow me to get back on the train. But in any event, I'm very honored to be here and to receive this award and to be joined with all of you tonight for dinner. I thought, given the timing of this event, it would be perhaps helpful to consider that we're right at the midpoint of the Obama administration. At least I hope we're right at the midpoint. We'll see. In any event, we're at the midpoint of this four term. So there's this. It's useful to be able to look back and then try and project ahead what challenges the United States is going to face and what we might see in response and what the consequences might be. And I have to tell you that I'm very concerned about the next 2 years based on a variety of circumstances because I think that the threats that the United States and its friends and allies are going to face will be increasing. And I think our capacity and our willingness to deal with them will be decreasing. Let me just start with what is an effort to try to understand what lies at the basis of President Obama's thinking, because that is a way of understanding the sometimes disparate statements and actions that an administration might take. It's often hard to weave them together, and certainly no administration, just like no individual, is ever entirely consistent. But I think in the case of President Obama, we have a very different kind of president when it comes to international affairs. He's very different in domestic affairs, too, but I don't have time to get into that. In the international arena, I think the most important characteristic of the president is that he fundamentally just doesn't care very much about foreign and national security policy. This makes him different from the long line of presidents of both parties since Franklin Roosevelt on December the 7th, 1941, where for most of them, for most of their time in their presidencies, national security was their principal concern. It's what got them up in the morning, it's what drove them during the day. Certainly, during the Cold War, we understood that quite well, and after 9/11, I think we understood it quite well. I don't think that's where Obama's coming from. I just don't think he believes that national security policy is anywhere near as important as his efforts to restructure the American economy. Number two, and closely related, I don't think he sees the rest of the world, or elements of the rest of the world, as threatening or challenging to our interests of those or our friends and neighbors. He resisted for a long time referring to a war on terrorism on the spurious ground that irritated Muslims around the world, as if they weren't often the victims of the very terrorism we were trying to fight as well. He referred during the 2008 campaign to Iran as being a tiny country, as if to say, therefore, it's a tiny problem. And sure, compared to the civilization-ending threat of an exchange of nuclear salvos with the Soviet Union, it's a smaller problem. Forgetting the fact that a nuclear-capable Iran with a mere handful of nuclear weapons is capable of destroying states like Israel or other tiny countries in the region, or with a tiny number of nuclear weapons, you can destroy a tiny number of American cities. Does that make it any less of a threat? I don't think so. But that's not his mentality. And I think that because these international threats didn't rise in his priority list, he was not uncomfortable with the prospect of American decline relative to other countries in the world. After all, if they're emerging and they're not a threat, what's the problem if in relative terms we're declining? Now, that in days of yore would have led a president who didn't care much about foreign policy and didn't think the world was terribly threatening. That would lead to a form of isolationism. That's obviously not where Obama has gone. He has retreated into multilateralism, where he thinks organizations or meetings like the G20 or the United Nations or this meeting with climate change in Copenhagen or what have you is the way you conduct business, where the United States, as community organizers like to say, the United States is just one more stakeholder at the table. Now, all of that says to me that this very different kind of presidency is in effect post-American. Post-American. I don't mean un-American, I don't mean anti-American, I mean post-American. Is that he is beyond these parochial views about patriotism and American exceptionalism and all that sort of thing. In his State of the Union speech this week, if you had to have a clear sign that the 2012 campaign is well underway, it's that so much of that speech sounded like a speech about American exceptionalism that in some cases evoked memories of Ronald Reagan. That's what he was trying to do. So that when people talk about the difference in his handling of the presidency, he can say, but gee, look at that speech. Like I talked about what a great country we live in. And some people, you could see in the analysis, were so ecstatic that the president praised our country, they said, proof positive he's moved to the Senate. Now, you know, if you buy that, I've got a bridge we can talk about, but my point is, this is the real Obama that we're dealing with, not the 2012 campaigner, but looking at the core performer who deals with foreign policy issues only when he has to, and whose every inclination is to take steps that inevitably weaken American national security and that of our friends around the world. People will say, but you know, look at what he's done on terrorism. Even though he won't use the phrase global war on terror, he's continued the Bush administration interrogation techniques. He's continued the use of military commissions to try some of the people who are held. He's kept Guantanamo Bay open. All of that's true, but every one of those decisions was made nearly over his broken body because he didn't want to do it. He simply was confronted with reality and had no possible way of getting around it. When he takes steps like that, which we should certainly welcome and applaud, it's not because he wants to, it's because he has no alternative. And the real measure of his foreign policy, therefore, has to be taken from the steps where he has more discretion, where he has more possibility for freedom of action. And that's where I think the record is most disturbing of all. Now, I'll try and cover some of these areas this evening. Unfortunately, it's a target-rich environment, as they say, because there's so much that's going wrong. But let's take a couple of examples, particularly those that are very contemporary, and see what's happening. The president just hosted Hu Jintao, the president of China, at the White House. And the entire question of China, it seems to me, is a graphic example of why we don't have a grand strategy under this administration for dealing with China, India, Russia, a number of other great or emerging powers. The president buys the analysis that is unfortunately all too widely held among American business leaders and many of our friends in Europe, and that is that in the jargon, China's economic growth means it's enjoying a peaceful rise, and that it will be a responsible stakeholder in world affairs. Well, that's possible. That's a possible scenario. It's a scenario based on a straight-line extrapolation of Chinese economic growth for the last 20-plus years. And of course, if you take any straight line and extend it indefinitely into the future, it can give some startling results. But for a civilization as old and rich and great as China's, 20 years is a drop in the bucket. Let's take a period a little bit longer, more in keeping with Chinese history. Let's take the last century, which has seen the fall of the last Chinese dynasty, the first establishment of the Republic of China, the first fall of the Republic of China, the breakup of China into warlord states and the civil wars between them, the Japanese invasion, the Second World War, the civil war between the nationalists and the communists, the victory over the Japanese, the second establishment of the Republic of China, the second fall of the Republic of China in 1949, the retreat to Taiwan, the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Then moving into the 1950s, the Great Leap Forward, the disastrous Mao Zedong economic policies, which killed more civilians than any other policy in the history of the world, followed then by the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution that destroyed centuries, if not millennia, of Chinese culture, then followed by the repression at Tiananmen Square, then followed by 20 years of economic growth. Now, if you take the last century and extrapolate that into the future, you get a century of radical discontinuity in China. You get a century of conflict and a century of problems spilling out into the rest of the world. And in many ways, we already see that happening by the part of the Chinese government that doesn't present the smiling face to Western business leaders. The People's Liberation Army remains the most powerful part of the Chinese Communist Party, which remains the most powerful part of the Chinese establishment. And the PLA is pursuing increased strategic nuclear weapons capabilities, increasing its submarine and blue water naval capabilities, increasing its cyber warfare and anti-satellite capabilities, increasing its area denial and anti-access capabilities to blunt the effect of American naval power in the Western Pacific, and generally preparing for something quite different than a peaceful rise. So what is the Obama administration's response to these alternative scenarios? Apparently it's to say, we've got a lot of stuff we want to sell you. And to hope that China keeps buying American debt for reasons that escape me why the Chinese would want to do it, especially as we learned today from the Congressional Budget Office that this fiscal year we face a $1.5 trillion deficit. $1.5 trillion. The President in the State of the Union kindly offered to freeze spending at current levels, except in a few areas where he wants to increase them. So I don't know how many people in their 20s there are here tonight, but if those policies continue, I want to thank you and your children for paying all this off for the rest of your natural lives, because you will own this debt if, in fact, we don't solve the problem. But this is not a way of dealing either with our own economy or a way of dealing with China. And I think the Chinese see this. I think they understand that the President doesn't have a clue what he's dealing with when it comes to China. I think they see a weak and inexperienced President, and I think they will and already have taken that into account in calibrating their policies going forward in a wide variety of areas, including in the key areas of nuclear proliferation dealing with North Korea and Iran. Now, one thing that motivates China very, very substantially is its quest for natural resources around the world. And nothing is higher on China's agenda than oil and natural gas. Which brings us naturally to the Middle East, where China has flown political cover for Iran in the Security Council, protecting it from really strict economic sanctions. China has helped prop up the dictatorial regime in the Sudan against